good evening, good afternoon, from wherever you are. And welcome to Connect Africa once again. We are here to discuss the important issues. One of the things that we are trying to do is, of course, to create awareness, to empower ourselves and our brothers and sisters with information, then we know how to act and what to do, in order to fight what we have to fight, because the struggle is not over yet. So today's topic is what are the signs and symptoms or characteristics of a neo-colonial agent in Africa. It could be a leader that he sits as a president or a prime minister. It could be just a minister. It could be just one of those big entrepreneurs who is sponsoring the votes, the election, or whatever, who's backing those people behind. But what are those signs that people have to pay attention? So I will pose a question, for each one of you you can respond. Maybe I think it's getting more late for Lambert than us, so we will start maybe with Lambert. So what are, as an ordinary African, what are the things that I can look at for a leader in my country or in Africa, that he or she is who are trying to impose neo-colonialism on their nation, under the disguise of Pan-Africanism, because most of the time we hear them doing their sweet talk to the people, but behind the curtain they are doing something else. So just, help us to understand what are the characteristics that we should look at.
Thank you, Mahlet, for this opportunity. It's always a pleasure to be having this kind of discussions, and it's good to have my colleagues Gonza and Case. I think I'm meeting Case for the first time, but I've been on a number of platforms with Gonza. Now, to delve immediately into your question, I want first to make it known to us that when we speak of neo-colonial agents in Africa, we must appreciate that they are not only within the ranks of the governments in power, but the complexity of the neo-colonial blueprint to keep Africa, to keep Africa under their control extends even to opposition elements within given countries, and not only in government, but in the different sectors, in the political and in the economic. But what then are the signs? How then do you tell, for instance, that a given person, whether it's a president, whether it's somebody posturing as a human rights defender within a country, whether it is somebody within opposition and actually trying to get power within a country, because we mustn't limit our thinking to imagining that it's only governments in power that have puppets for the West. We have them even in opposition. So I think the first one, particularly when somebody is in power, and for me, the most obvious one is the fact that you must look at what are the ideals that the West stands for, what the ideals that the US stands for. One of them, their biggest export, apparently, is democracy. Now, you're going to look at a country, and you're going to see a president of a given country completely doing the opposite of what democracy is, completely going against what the ideals of democracy are, committing crimes that do not completely match with the idea of what democracy is. And yet, while that president does so, the West either turns a blind eye or, in fact, continues to fund and support that kind of leader. That is, for me, the first clear indicator of a puppet. And there are so many examples. And usually this happens in countries which have resource endowments, which the West is looking at exploiting, regardless of whether that person is a Democrat or not. For example, we can take the example of the Congo. You remember the last president, that is Siseko Mobutu. The West willingly looted Congo while allowing Siseko Mobutu to do whatever he wanted to do, to kill, to butcher, and the guy was basically a complete dictator. But the West turned a blind eye. So they overlooked their ideal of democracy and still supported Mobutu. Now, that one is a clear indicator. When you see a president is undemocratic by all standards, and yet the West continues to support them, or rather keeps quiet in the event of all these undemocratic practices. That gives a clear indication that that one president is actually a neo-colonial agent. Because you must understand what is neo-colonialism. And now neo-colonialism has two edges. One is on the political aspect. The other one is on economic. Now it's all about exploitation. If you look at it from an economic perspective, they're looking at how do they get what is in Africa. Because we have had so many discussions. We have discussed about how they're exploiting us. When you go to Mali, Niger, Senegal, where Casey comes from, we know that that you have France. France, for example, has the bulk of its military bases within that place, and we know that they are so much interested within that belt between Niger, Mali, Senegal, and we know why. We know that there is uranium which is used to light up about 75% of the bulbs in Paris. Now, so that tells you that the exploitation of resources is very significant, and one of the key things that neocolonialism looks at. Now, when a leader is willing to submit to that and to allow that level of exploitation, then the West is going to overlook democracy, because democracy is not the most important thing so long as people are able to get their resources. So that's number one, and for me the most significant, and it comes in very different ways. Even in Ethiopia, Mahlet, you're from Ethiopia. You remember, I don't think the last president was so democratic. That is that was President Hon.
Meles Zenawi.
Meles Zenawi wasn't exactly democratic, but you know, he somehow had a good working relationship with the West. So they overlooked the democracy, which they believe, which they want to export to us and keep telling us is the most important thing to them. There is nothing that the West does without telling you about democracy. And yet, in the instance of those countries, they overlook it. Now, when you see them overlooking democracy, then you know that one is a colonial agent. They have valued the resources they will get more than their democracy. That is the first. Then the other one, how does this country, the second, how does a given country's economic policies relate with the transnational companies, with the corporations from the West? Look at Uganda. Well, you can take Uganda and most other countries. Most of our big projects of infrastructure are funded and actually constructed by people from the West, or rather from outside a given country. Is it for lack of human knowledge? Is it for lack of skills? Why then do we train? Because I know that we have engineers who are as good as the engineers from China, who are as good as the engineers from Russia, who are as good as, perhaps even better than the engineers from the US. But you will find that big and mega projects, which involve trillions of money, are given to corporations from the West. As we speak right now, the US is sending its army back to Somalia. I posted the other day on my Twitter feed, and I spoke about what the real intentions, for me, in my own understanding, of the US is in Somalia. Now, they posted back their soldiers there, their military there, but the fact is that it is not Al-Shabaab, it's not the rebels that they're going to fight. There is something that these people are obviously looking at. And I also posted an agreement that was previously signed by an American corporation and the minister of Somalia by then, which fortunately at that point the president Famajo decided to cancel. But that tells you the interest of the Western corporations in exploiting the resources that are in African countries. Now, depending on the relationship between a given president or leader of a given country, or even a minister like that particular one in Somalia, you are able to see that these people are operating under the instructions of the West, and therefore are colonial agents. Even still in Senegal, in West Africa, the companies that are drilling these resources, uranium and the rest, are actually French-based companies. They are not companies from that place. Now that tells you why would you not only give out your resources, but also have those who are drilling them and digging them up and looting them to be corporations from the West, because they can only be accountable to the governments in the West. You must have a French company exploiting and looting resources from Senegal, from Mali, from Chad, because they must only account to the West, not to the president of that particular country. Now, that is the second dimension, the corporations, and they are so spread out throughout Africa. And it is not for lack or inability of Africans to exploit these resources. So those two significant factors for me are what stand out. There could be, and of course certainly there are other indicators. But then again, like I said, it is not only we can't and shouldn't only look at it from a perspective of the governments in power, because we also understand that the West is so smart and so complex in its operations that sometimes they have, let me give this example. We know of some of the wars that have taken place in the world where the West funded both sides. So why am I bringing this perspective? You have people in government who are certainly serving neo-colonial interests, but also you have some people who are apparently outside of government, but they also serve neo-colonial interests. And in that respect, then comes the third indicator of a neo-colonial agent who may not necessarily be in government. Look at the different African countries. One of the things the West does as a way of keeping the government in power in check and obedient to them and subservient to them is to ensure that they put a balancing force outside of government. And these ones normally come in the name of human rights defenders. Of course, it is true, we have human rights abuses. We have human rights abuses in Africa, which of course we don't want. But we also have human rights abuses in the West. But the way they are going to project the human rights abuses in Africa is that they come up with so-called champions. So you find you have one African in Uganda, a black man, who is propped up by the West to be a political and a balancing force for those in government. You have a so-called human rights defender in Zimbabwe who is supporting, for example, sanctions against his own country. Now, these are political balancing forces, but you must realize that they operate under the tutelage and urging and indeed the funding of the West. How do you know they are agents of the West? Number one, you will always see them attending conferences in the West. Immediately they come into the spotlight, you will see them going for studies in an American university, in an American Institute of Leadership, or something like that. Why do you think that's the case? Because they must go and be indoctrinated. Immediately, you will see the so-called defenders of human rights enlisting foreign lawyers from the US. Now, because you need a contact between you and the State Department. So whether somebody is in government or in opposition, the moment you see somebody apparently claiming to be a champion of human rights, which of course we admit it is true, there are human rights abuses, but that does not mean that somebody has not been put in place by the West and is acting as a neo-colonial agent. Because while human rights abuses are a fact in Africa, while the abuse of human rights exists in Africa, and we wouldn't want to have those rights, they also exist in the West. I could tell you that in terms of human rights abuse, the US, for example, is one of the countries with the highest levels of abuse of human rights. I don't think I have to go into that. Every day you have people being killed. Every day you have policemen are killing black people, whether based on race and all those factors. But when it comes to Africa, you always have what they call champions of human rights. Where are the champions of human rights in the US? But you have them in Africa, and those are the people we are going to listen to. But you see, they exploit our weaknesses, they exploit our failures, and they get somebody who becomes a champion, and then they begin to use that person. So now that is in the field of human rights. But like I said, it's a broad field, and perhaps I'm going to give one last, and that's the fourth one. I want to look at the media itself, because the media itself has become a tool of neo-colonial control for Africa. Let me give you this example. In Uganda, for example, you have a local radio station in my village here where I stay, for example, in Uganda, and every evening they stream BBC News to their audience here in Uganda. Now, you must appreciate that the West has understood the power of the media to control the narrative, whatever narrative they have within the African continent. And the records show that the British government, for example, has invested a lot more money to ensure that there is an expansion of broadcasts of the British media in Africa in local languages. They're investing more money to ensure that the BBC can reach and speak in languages local to Africa. Do they love Africa that they are willing to invest much of their money to inform us what do they want to inform us? But you see, even in the media, you have people, influencers, people with a large following, people whom we see as credible sources of information within Africa, who have been enlisted by the West. So how do you tell that they are working for the West when they begin every time to defend the narrative that is put forward by the West? A clear example has been the recent war in Ukraine. You need to look at the Africans who are driving the clearly biased narrative being put forward by the West. The media houses within Africa, which are driving the Western narrative, that tells you that these people are being funded by the West. Ethiopia actually is a good example. You have seen the people, the so-called journalists. By the way, Africans, I remember the one from Sudan. At some point, that was who? Nima somebody. That lady, if you were to listen to her or read what she was saying, you could almost conclude that she's actually white, if not only for her color, which is, I think, much darker than mine. That's the only way you could tell that she's actually black. But in everything she was doing, you could almost think that she is Western. And you could imagine why is it, why this kind of passion? And you could tell, and I can assure you, of late, she has no longer been so active in this, because somehow we managed to demystify her. We managed to expose all the lies. Some of them were so blatant. So when you see an African so-called journalist giving blatant lies against an African country, then you must understand that they are serving Western interests. Do you know why they use them? Because it is easier for us in Africa to listen to a fellow black journalist and believe them. If they use a white man to write, we can simply say, that is a white, what is he speaking about? So they get one of our own, and then they use that person to drive a narrative. Now, when you see somebody do that so blatantly, then you understand that this person has been enlisted by the West and is a neo-colonial agent. I think I will end there, Mahlet.
Wow, really. Thank you very much, Brother Lambert. That was really, you were speaking to me. Like I was in it. I was like retrieving all the incidents that happened in the past 2 years in Ethiopia, or, generally in the continent. I was speaking to my brother from Chad yesterday, and when you said, these people, one of the things to identify them is they are the one who attends the conference and the one who study in their university. So this man was saying how Idris Deby was taught by them in France and, completely became their agent in a way. So it's not history or something, it's something that we hear every day. Thank you.